Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is the lecture for Friday, the 20th of May, 2022. And we're going to start with a little bit of a rewind. I realized that yesterday I didn't conclude the story of the Battle of Stalingrad. I told you about how bloody it was, and I showed you a clip, and I told you about how the Germans arrived. That was in August. Soviet forces were desperately trying to keep a foothold in the city of Stalingrad from August, September, October, November, as it's getting colder. Now, the Germans also have their front along the Don River and through the gap between the Don and the Volga to the areas they control in Stalingrad and to some areas to the south. That is basically the German line. However, as the snow falls and as the winter temperatures arrive, the Russians, which have also been building up serious forces to the north of the Don River and to the east of Stalingrad, launch an attack. Now, this area is held by Allied troops of Germany, Hungarians particularly. These are not grade A troops. So the Soviets cut through the German lines. Color. It's still got to be red. So the Soviets cut through the German lines here and here. And they're going to meet up. Whether they meet up east of the Don River in the little isthmus between the two or west of the Don River is unclear at the moment. Now, what the German General Staff wants to do is assume that the Russians have an advantage during the winter months, withdraw the 6th Army from Stalingrad across the Don and back into the German lines, thus saving the lives and the equipment of 6th Army to fight again next year. But Hitler is stubborn. Remember, he became a corporal in World War I. He was a messenger. He's a soldat, soldier. And Hitler, politically, has been right more than he's been wrong throughout his recent career. Now, Churchill was a soldier also. Churchill fought in India. He fought in the Sudan. He was part of the last British cavalry charge in the world. Even though he wasn't a soldier, he ended up fighting in the Boer War personally. And he also led forces in World War I. Actually, between the time he was the Navy minister and the Minister of Munitions, he did serve as a colonel in the Western Front. So Churchill has considerable military experience, plus he's a historian who's an expert on his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and his military campaigns, which led to the Battle of Lenin. So Churchill, like Hitler, gets involved in the details of military strategy. He has ideas about how to move and use Britain's forces. Hitler does with Germany. But a key difference is that Churchill is a constitutional prime minister. He never, ever overrides the solid opposition of his military chiefs. The cabinet probably wouldn't support it, and Churchill's power in government is limited. He needs the support of his cabinet. Also, I think on some basic level, he appreciates if the military is wishy-washy, Churchill will get his way. But if the military is solidly against one of his ideas, he won't talk about it much, but there's probably a good reason for that. So Churchill will back off, and in the end, he will defer to his military chiefs. Not so with Hitler. Hitler knows better than anyone. After all, he's their Führer. He's the boss. He's the leader. He's the spiritual leader of Germany. People greet one another in his name, Heil Hitler, or they say Sieg Heil, which is Hail Victory. So Hitler is synonymous with victory. And this does go to his artistic head. Hitler likes the idea of people standing and dying as a way of wearing down the morale and resources of the enemy and encouraging his soldiers to fight and fight and fight. Now, there are times when standing and fighting is absolutely the right thing to do militarily. But that isn't all the time. It's much better to retreat and preserve your army for a more favorable opportunity in the future than it is to sacrifice needlessly 250,000 men, 500,000 men. But Hitler has his way. He overrides his chiefs. So, the Soviet forces cut off Stalingrad, and the German forces are some distance away. Actually, not sure at all. Use these things. So the Germans control part of Stalingrad, part of the outskirts. And that means that von Paulus and the Sixth Army are now cut off from the rest of the German forces. Well, the military leaders hate this, except one. Hermann Goering, the rotund drug addict transvestite, who is the World War I hero and the leader of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, says, don't worry about it. I'll drop supplies into Stalingrad by air. I will supply the city, the army, by air until next spring when the mud's thawed. Hitler goes along with it. Why not? But the Luftwaffe never even sends a 20th of the supplies that the German forces need day by day. German planes get shot down, and German planes simply do not have the wherewithal. They don't have the cargo capacity to supply an army with all of its ammunition, food, and medical needs for months at a time in the Russian winter against opposition. Now, there's a great Soviet newsreel, and it shows this, like in the, if you remember Alexander Nevsky, this sort of white expanse of snow, the big sky above it. And then from both sides, you've got masses of men running, walking and then running towards the center and embracing one another. And what that is a picture of, supposedly, is these two pincers coming together and cutting off the Germans in Stalingrad. It's perfectly filmed. The camera has no motion. Everything is in focus. What does that tell you? See, in real combat, cameramen don't want to die. So in real combat, the camera usually moves all over the place. And they don't have everything in perfect focus, and everything isn't perfectly staged so that both groups of men meet in the center of your shot, which you had set up before they even began to come on screen. So it was staged. But, war propaganda, people do that. So now von Paulus is cut off. The German generals try to betray Hitler without betraying Hitler. They launch an attack into and towards Stalingrad. But they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the force in the Russian winter, even this far south. This is pretty south as far as Russia goes, to punch through on their own. They need von Paulus to attack westward to meet them halfway. Von Paulus can't or won't. His troops are starving to death. They have limited ammo. Can they do an attack on the Russians that surround them? No. Is von Paulus willing to defy Hitler openly, which is what that would require? Not yet, no. Because there are ardent Nazis in his command post that would shoot him in the head if he did. So the attack towards Stalingrad sputters and fails, and the Germans withdraw. And now it's only a matter of time, January of 1943 into February, when the Germans finally surrender. Sixth Army surrenders, von Paulus, the German commander, surrenders. Actually, Hitler in the last minute, tries to encourage von Paulus to die like a hero by promoting von Paulus from general to field marshal, the highest rank in the German army. No Prussian or German field marshal has ever allowed himself to be captured alive. What Hitler expects in return for this is that von Paulus will swallow his revolver and depress the trigger. Now, von Paulus surrenders. He actually is treated to a bit of Soviet brainwashing. Unlike most of his men, he's not worked to death in slave labor camps, and he ends up more cozy with the Russians than the Germans like. So, good job, Russians. Battle of Stalingrad is finally over, February 43, and the German lines have been pushed back west of, they actually are shoved back further down towards Rostov and beyond Rostov, north of the Sea of Azov. So now we'll leave the Russian front. Those are the turning point battles in 1942. At the end of 42, in November, something surprising happens as far as the French and the Germans are concerned. This is largely French North Africa, from Tunis to Kasserine. And the French government in Vichy works for the Germans. Now, at that time, the French and the Americans had a warm relationship, went back to the American Revolution. The French were America's allies that allowed the American Revolution to succeed. General Pershing, when he arrives in France in World War I, says, Lafayette, we are here. The French and the British don't get along particularly at this time, because the French had an odd pride. They were disastrously beaten by the Germans in 1940. They were spanked, they were humiliated. However, after the French surrender, before the French surrender, French troops helped defend Dunkirk to allow British and French troops to leave. That's something. And the French Navy, before the surrender, leaves France and goes to a bunch of ports in North Africa, particularly a place called Kabir. And the French Navy refuses to do anything. They're going to basically stay there. They're not going to steam the ships into Germany. They're not going to let the Germans take them. They're going to hold on to them themselves. It's a matter of pride. Well, the British are not going to allow a significant battle fleet to be near their throat, uncontrolled, for French pride. So, a couple of months after the French surrender, British warships appear everywhere where French ships are. And these British warships have the same message for the local fleet commanders. You have three choices. Join us in fighting alongside the Free French for the restoration of your homeland's freedom. We would love that. Or scuttle your own vessels. Sink them. Open your seacocks, let the water in, or we will be forced to sink them. Now, the French Navy, unlike the Army, was rather infiltrated by right-wing politics. Action Française and other French fascists were prominent in the French fleet. Oh, the French were also offered the opportunity to steam to Britain and be interned, basically neutralized. But in Britain, where Britain could be sure that the French ships wouldn't fall into German hands. So, you can join us, you can be interned, you can sink your own ships, or we will sink them. At Mirza Kabir, where the majority of the French fleet is, and at all the other fleet places too, the French dither and wait, and it seems like they're stalling in order to get German aircraft or French aircraft or reinforcements into the area. So after a limited amount of time, with regret, the British fleet sinks the French fleet. A number of few hundred French sailors are killed in each of these events as the French ships are sunk at Casablanca, Kabir, and elsewhere. Psychology is a funny thing. The French feared and hated the Germans from 1871 until 1940, and before that, and after that. The alliance with Britain saved France in World War One, but the British and French had a lot of friction between them. But now Britain had sunk French ships and shed French blood. The French neglect the fact that Britain offered the ships a bunches of ways to avoid Britain firing on them. That Britain, while fighting an active war against the Nazis, could not allow the French fleet to be a big question mark. If the Germans had gotten a hold of the French fleet, the invasion of Britain would have been much easier. It also demonstrated to the Americans that this British government under Churchill was not Chamberlain. That Churchill would make the hard decisions and fight, do whatever is necessary to fight and win the war. But the French right wing particularly become vehemently anti-British. So as much as possible, the Anglo-American forces that have snuck their way into the Mediterranean between Oran and Casablanca are going to be led by American troops landing. American planes going overhead. The British are going to take part too, but in order to not trigger the French into unnecessary fighting with the Allies, let's let the Americans go first. The French like the Americans like the French. Maybe there won't be fighting. In 1942, late 1942, Operation Torch is launched. Now, Operation Torch is the Anglo-American invasion of North Africa. In early 1942, at Casablanca, the U.S. battleship Massachusetts sinks the half-completed French battleship Jean Bart. American troops land all along the coast in a variety of places, along with British forces. What will the French do? Will the Vichy French fire on Americans? In some places, no. In some places, the Vichy French immediately surrender and change sides. Sometimes a few officers need to be killed. But in a number of places, the Americans are fired upon by the French. The Vichy fight on the side of Nazi Germany against the British and the Americans who are trying to liberate. Eventually, Admiral Darlan, the leader of the French forces in North Africa and the leader of the French fleet, negotiates a surrender. He is assassinated a few weeks after that. But Operation Torch places Anglo-American forces, blue-green color, in North Africa, west of Tunisia. Anglo-American forces are here. After the Battle of El Alamein, which happens in the same month, British forces are pursuing Rommel and the Afrika Korps from the east. The goal of both sides is to pinch out the Germans in Tunis. Again, Hitler and Mussolini have the opportunity to evacuate their armies from North Africa to Sicily and Italy before the arrival of the Anglo-Americans. Hitler refuses. Mussolini brings a few of his troops out, but without Hitler's full cooperation, not much is done. The Americans attack in the west towards Tunisia across a mountain range at a place called Kasserine Pass. At Kasserine Pass, American troops first encounter the Germans. A number of Americans throw their rifles in the air and run away. There is massive panic and flight among the green American forces. The Germans and the British start calling the Americans the British Italians, because the Italians fight so poorly in World War II. The feeling is that if Kasserine Pass shows what American soldiers are like, there's nothing to worry about because they're freaking cowards. The American commander is replaced by a new man named General George S. Patton. General Patton has a very different attitude from his predecessor. Patton's attitude is, well, actually, there is a speech that was said by Patton that explains his attitude very well, and it was acted, read word for word, but acted at the beginning of the movie Patton from 1970, which I will play for you. So Patton's words seem jarring to us today. We're not used to hearing people talk like that today. And the next time we are in a war, a real war, we better remember some of that, because the politically correct stuff doesn't really work at motivating people to put their lives at risk for their country. Patton does sow steel into the backbone of the American troops. He wins some battles, as Montgomery wins some battles, and they both arrive at Tunis and capture about 1 million German and Italian prisoners. North Africa is taken by the middle of 43. This is part of the third and last phase of the war, from 43 to 45, a time of Allied advances. After Tunis, we have gotten enough landing craft to mount the invasion of Sicily in preparation of Italy, invading Italy. Now, the British commander, Bernard Law Montgomery, gets his plan approved. The British plan is to land at Syracuse and march north towards Messina. Once you take Messina, you cut off the German retreat and you basically take the island. Patton is supposed to play a secondary role, landing here at Gila and basically covering the British left flank. So the plan begins as the British expect. The British land at Syracuse. The Americans land at Gila. But Patton is rather hard to control. He's very aggressive, as you've seen. By the way, the scene that you saw has one glaring historical inaccuracy. Since it's the opening scene of a Hollywood movie made at the height of the Vietnam War, which did have an impact on the Vietnam War. President Nixon saw the movie and a couple of hours later decided to expand the war to include the bombing of Cambodia, which was a necessary thing, but it was very controversial. America had not yet lost a war. That happened a few years later. So Patton is rather hard to control. Oh, what was inaccurate? He was wearing all of the medals and the rank that he earned at the end of the war at the time of his death. Not the rank he wore and the medals he had earned at the beginning of his fight, which is when that speech was said. So there's an inaccuracy. In any case, instead of simply guarding the British flank, Patton goes off mission. He takes the important Sicilian city of Palermo, while the British are stuck fighting their way through hill country. He then races Montgomery to Messina and beats him. Beating Montgomery and also beating the Germans as quickly and as harshly as possible became Patton's top goal. This irritated the high command that wanted to follow the British plan. Well, Patton irritates them, but there's something more. During the fight in Sicily, Patton visits an aid station where wounded men have been worked on by doctors close to the battlefield. And he brings a number of Purple Hearts, which is the American medal given to anyone wounded or killed in battle. So he places Purple Hearts on men who will never walk again, on men who are completely covered with bandaging because they've been burned, but they're still alive. The kind of horrid battle wounds that I'm not going to describe any further. And then he walks up and sees a guy on the end, sitting on his bunk with his head in his hands, crying. Now, Patton personally believes in reincarnation. He believes, and I'm not making this up, he wrote about it, he spoke about it, that he is the reincarnation of the eternal warrior, that he was there for the battles with Hannibal and the destruction of Carthage, and at various times throughout history, he was there to lead men in battle. Strange belief, but there it was. For him, he wasn't just a soldier, he was a warrior. And he looked for the man's wounds and didn't find any and said, "What are you here for?" And one of the nurses says, "He's here for battle fatigue." Remember, shell shock, battle fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, Patton had seen some of this in World War I, but he never understood it. He never acknowledged it as a real thing. To him, it was baloney, cowardice. So he started yelling at the man, and he struck him. And basically, the scene ends with him saying, "You're not going home. You're not going anywhere but back to the front. Get this cowardly SOB back to the front. Get him there today. Get him there now." Now, Americans, civilians, will put up with a lot of things, but officers smacking soldiers around, oddly enough, is one of the things Americans in 1943 weren't willing to put up with. So Patton almost was sacked. He was almost dropped, court-martialed and dropped from the army and sent home, which would have been a shame because he was among our best field commanders in that entire war. But he did have to acknowledge, and he did have to publicly apologize. And he did so. He said that his motivation was to help the man find his courage by shaming him, which is a very father sort of masculine thing to do. It's not something that nurturing people really understand, but I understand it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. In any event, Sicily is taken. The next target is Italy. So Anglo-American forces have even more landing craft, and with warships, move up to the Gulf of Naples and the beaches of Salerno, where American forces and British forces land, take Naples. As the American forces are landing, the fascist Grand Council overthrows Mussolini. They put a general named Badoglio in charge. Mussolini's imprisoned, and this government begins to surrender. However, the Germans got wind of this before it happened, and they basically launch an invasion of Italy that is super lightning fast, because a number of their troops went into Italy when they were before they started attacking and taking command of the Italian forces. So the Germans end up establishing a defensive line in southern Italy along a mountain frontier. And the Italians either serve the Germans or get out of the way, and Mussolini is sent to a prison on a mountaintop. The British and American troops hit this wall and bounce back and recoil from it because you try attacking up mountains that the enemy controls the peaks of. It's not easy. And one of these mountains is Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino has a monastery that Leonardo da Vinci worked on. You may remember the Last Supper. Monte Cassino is where the Last Supper is painted on fresco into the wall of the cafetorium. The Germans hold Monte Cassino Monastery. British and American troops try going up the mountainside, doing minimum damage to the place because we don't want to destroy a world treasure, and get slaughtered, get driven down. British and American troops again go up the mountain a second time, again trying to play nice and get slaughtered. After this, the American commander says, "The hell with the place, bomb it to smithereens." So, American medium and heavy bombers flatten the monastery at Monte Cassino. The problem is the Germans have deep cellars to hide in, and when the bombing is done, the rubble actually makes better fortifications than the original monastery did. It's still a bloodbath. Eventually, we fight our way up the hill and into the ruins of the monastery. The amazing thing is, after the battle, which cost a lot of lives, the one wall that wasn't destroyed is the wall that had the Last Supper. It's got machine gun bullets riddling the painting, which they've had to restore since then. But the painting and the wall was not destroyed. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, everything around it just blasted piles of wreckage. Not the Last Supper. So there's an interesting story there, and I don't really understand it. I'm just pleased. It's quite a painting. So the plan is, well, we've got naval supremacy, we've got air superiority, at least to a degree. Why let this line, I think it's called the Gothic line, stop us? What we're going to do is we're going to launch a seaborne attack to the beaches of Anzio, south of Rome, and we'll just take Rome, and suddenly the Gothic line will be behind our lines, and we'll be able to hit from both sides, advance upward. That's the plan. The Americans are put in command of this operation, and the American commander is a cautious fellow. And this caution is going to play out in the battle. Looking back on it, it's clear you need a go-getter like Patton. But Patton's in disgrace because of the Slappy incident. So the American commander here decides he lands. There's no opposition. The Germans and the Italians have no idea that this is going to happen. And when it does, it catches them totally by surprise. Scouting forces go into Rome. Nobody's stopping them. But rather than launch his army, just lurch it into Rome to take the city before the Germans fortify it, he holds the beach and consolidates his position, landing more supplies, setting up a defensive perimeter. This caution allows the Germans to cut him off, place him in a pocket on the coast, which is what they do. And Anzio becomes synonymous with a failed attack. It's a bloodbath until months later when the Gothic line is finally broken and forces head towards Rome. So if you're landing troops for an aggressive attack, be aggressive, be aggressive. Eventually on June 4th, 1944, 2 days before D-Day, in northern France, Rome is declared an open city, and the Allies end up going through it. But just north of Rome, they encounter the Gustav line. And actually, I may be screwing them up. Gothic line is one of them. Gustav line is another. This is probably the Gustav line. This is probably the Gothic line. In any case, the Allies are back to square one. They're stuck in Italy like a fly on flypaper. So Italy is becoming this grindy, almost World War I type set of mountain battles, and it is not the kind of war we want to fight. It's a stalemate. Now we shift east. The Russian front includes Leningrad, which is besieged by the Germans, and the Finns have moved back in to take the northern outskirts and to take the land back they lost in the Winter War. The Finns are not in open alliance with the Germans. In fact, the Germans want the Finns to do a lot more. The Finns refuse. They scrupulously go back to where they were before the Winter War, and that's where they stay. And because Hitler respects Mannerheim and has no way to compel him, Mannerheim, the leader of the Finns, and because Hitler respects him personally, that's acceptable. The amazing thing is that after World War II, Finland was not attacked by the Soviets. Finland had to immediately give up, like a dog rolling over and exposing its belly, all the land that the Russians took in the Winter War, and the Finns got rid of Mannerheim and had to agree to be neutral and demilitarized and all that stuff. And as a result of that, the Soviets didn't invade Finland. So, Leningrad's besieged in the north. You've got the front, well in front of Moscow, and you've got this salient here, this bulge, which we'll talk about, going down to the Sea of Azov. The salient is at a place called Kursk. And in 1943, Hitler is preparing his last offensive. He doesn't know it's his last offensive yet, but it's going to be his last offensive in the east. And his plan is to attack into the salient at Kursk, cut it off, pinch it out, and straighten the line. This is much less grand than taking Baku or taking Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev, but it's 1943. So Hitler is going to punch out the Kursk salient. And to do this, he gathers the largest group of tanks the Germans ever have in one place, including the brand new Panther tanks and Tiger tanks, which by World War II standards are super tanks. Very hard to destroy, very, very powerful guns, more so than anything the Russians have. However, this is an obvious plan. And in 1943, the Russians had beat the Germans at Stalingrad. So in 1943, the Soviets have their own plan. And their plan is to pinch off the German edges of the salient and then punch through. The Germans call this Operation Citadel. And the annoying thing for them is that 6 hours before their surprise attack at Kursk, the Russians launch a preventative artillery barrage with rockets and guns, which end up damaging the German forces and proving to everyone that the Russians know exactly what's coming. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 is the largest tank battle in human history. Thousands of tanks on both sides fighting one another. Now, some of the tanks have radios, some of the tanks don't. You've got the use of anti-tank guns. You've got the use of Stuka dive bombers with cannons diving on the tanks, the Russian tanks, the T-34s, and so forth. And it is a grinding tank battle that cuts the heart out of the German army. From Stalingrad onward, the Germans don't succeed at advancing. From Stalingrad onward, the Germans are going to be on the defensive and the Russians are attacking. The Germans' last attempt at an offensive at Kursk utterly fails. The Russians roll them up, and they are ready to drive hard into Europe the following year in 1944. And that's where we will leave things today. Any questions, comments, or thoughts?
I guess this still relates, but it's a little off topic. What is the functional purpose of pants that look like that, like in the video?
Oh, those are cavalry.
Out?
Those are cavalry pants. If you're on a horse, you have the boots, you have the poofy pants to give you a lot of motion, so you can ride, you can walk, you can do all sorts. They're cavalry pants. I forget what they're called. I think Jodhpurs makes them today. Okay. If you know of anyone who's an equestrian, who's a horse person, today they have less poofy because we have much more stretchy fabrics. But in those days, they basically didn't have many stretchy fabrics.
They did it so it would just be a lot more movement.
It wouldn't bind.
Oh,
yeah, that's the point of those.
I was like, those do. They look so weird.
Well, it's a style. The Germans love those too. Yes.
Well, in English writing, they wear the English writing pants, which are really like stretchy. But in Western writing, you wear jeans.
Yeah, that's Western writing, though.
That's the best writing.
Yeah. So you say you're from the West.
It's so much better.
You don't wear the cute little cap
or the really long, ridiculous boots.
Yes. And the saddles are different too.
Yeah, well,
Western saddles have the handy
and they're
bolt.
just smaller. That's for the purpose of being able to jump.
Even the bridles are different.
Yeah. Oh, when I'm thinking of equestrians, I'm thinking of the fancy, schmancy English writing.
Indeed.
Any other questions or comments or thoughts? Okay. Then thank you. You may talk among yourselves.